I came home that Monday to find my company email already locked, my badge deactivated, and my 17 years of loyalty reduced to a single line in a conference room. My boss sat there with human resources at his side, announcing flatly, "Mark, after 17 years, we're eliminating your position. Clean out your desk by end of day." I nodded once, politely, and said the only thing I knew would keep me standing upright. I told them I understood completely. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that Wednesday would be fun. They had assumed I would shuffle out like an obedient employee, head down, defeated. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. My name is Mark Holloway. I'm 52 years old, and until that morning I was a senior systems engineer at Halverson Dynamics in Denver, Colorado. 17 years of my life had been spent inside that building, watching it grow from a mid-sized regional firm into a national name. I'd built the backbone of its infrastructure, stitched its networks together, trained fresh graduates who could barely code their way out of a template. 3 CEOs had come and gone while I stayed, steady as the servers humming in the basement. My loyalty wasn't just professional, it was personal. I'd skipped family holidays, missed birthdays, sacrificed weekends to keep that place alive. And in return, I was discarded like a broken piece of equipment, obsolete and unwanted. But I didn't fight. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. That's not how I was built. My strength has never been in raised voices or dramatic gestures. It's been in planning, in observing quietly while others underestimate me. I walked out of that room without a single word, and in doing so, I carried more power than they realized. Back at my desk, I began to pack the pieces of my life methodically. The framed photo of my daughter from her graduation. The coffee mug my son made in 7th grade pottery class. The same cactus I'd watered once a week for nearly 2 decades, somehow surviving the fluorescent desert of that office. My coworkers stole glances, whispering about how unfair it was, but none of them knew what I knew. Over those years, I had documented everything. Every system change, every financial irregularity, every unexplained transfer hidden beneath layers of digital camouflage. Not because I was suspicious, but because I was thorough. Because being thorough was the only way to survive in a place like this. I slipped my last flash drive into my pocket before shutting down my computer for the final time. Outside, the Colorado sky stretched wide and empty. I sat in my car, staring at the 12-story building where I'd given almost half my life, and I felt no rage, no grief. Just clarity. They believed they had buried me. In reality, they had just removed the last chain holding me in place. By Wednesday, the same people who dismissed me would learn what it meant to underestimate the quiet man in the corner. The next morning, the silence in my house felt heavier than the layoff itself. No alarm clock, no commute, no unread emails stacked against me. Just the weight of a 17-year routine, broken in an instant. My wife, Emily, set a cup of coffee on the table beside me without saying much. After 24 years together, she could read the storm brewing behind my calm face. I told her I was fine, that things would work themselves out. But inside, my mind was already sharpening. I didn't feel ruined. I felt awake. For years, I'd carried an off-site backup system the company had forgotten existed. Years ago, legal demanded redundancy protocols to protect against insider threats. I designed it myself. The paperwork was signed and filed, and then forgotten. Except I never forgot. A small detail buried in the company's mountain of policies had given me the right to store encrypted backups outside headquarters. Nobody cared, because nobody thought they'd ever need them. But I had them. And inside those backups was everything. I went down to the basement where I kept my safe, opened it, and pulled out a small stack of drives, each labeled carefully, year by year. Inside were logs of access requests, archived emails, system changes. Not because I ever suspected fraud, but because it was my job to anticipate failure, to record the trails no one else cared to follow. Now those trails led somewhere. 3 months ago, during a late-night maintenance cycle, I'd stumbled across transactions routed through a vendor called Crestfield Technologies. It wasn't unusual for vendors to appear suddenly. Consultants came and went like seasons. But Crestfield was different. The payments were small at first, then ballooned month after month. What caught my eye wasn't the size, but the routing. Payments funneled through shadow accounts before landing at Crestfield. It smelled wrong. I copied the records, told myself I'd look closer when I had time. And then I got fired. I spent Tuesday mapping the pattern across 17 months of financial logs. Every payment bore the signature of the CFO, Martin Kane. I traced ownership of Crestfield and found the registered agent was a woman named Allison Kane, his sister. A shell company, siphoning money under everyone's nose. By the time I finished calculating, nearly $2.6 million had disappeared. It was elegant. Not enough to trigger external audits, but steady enough to build a fortune over years. I didn't call anyone. I didn't rant on social media or complain to friends. That's not how I operate. I simply compiled the files into a neat folder labeled Proof and set the drive aside. Tuesday night, I sat on my porch, watching the streetlights flicker on. To anyone passing, I looked like a man nursing quiet defeat. But inside, I was arranging the board piece by piece. They thought they buried me under a pink slip. What they didn't realize is that I was already sitting on the kind of evidence that could fracture their empire in two. Tomorrow was Wednesday, board meeting day, and I was done being silent. Wednesday morning, I sat in my car across the street from Halverson Dynamics. I watched the employees file into the glass tower the way they always did, coffee in hand, eyes half shut, unaware of the storm brewing inside their own walls. To them, it was just another day. To me, it was the day I stopped being a ghost in the system and started becoming the man who would rewrite the ending. In the passenger seat beside me was my old laptop. I'd wiped it clean, rebuilt it from scratch, and loaded only one set of files. The financial trail that linked Crestfield Technologies to Martin Kane. I wasn't reckless enough to dump everything at once. Precision mattered. If I exposed too much too quickly, they would dismiss it as the bitter ramblings of a fired employee. No, I needed to bleed this slowly, with surgical accuracy, until there was no way to cover it up. At 9:07 a.m., I composed an email from a secure account I created years earlier for penetration testing. It looked like an internal Halverson address, but it wasn't. The subject line read, "Financial irregularities, urgent review needed." Inside, I attached a single-page summary of payments routed to Crestfield, with enough detail to show credibility, but not enough to expose my full hand. I left out the family connection. That part was a weapon for later. I sent it to Martin Kane himself and to Daniel Foster, the CEO who had fired me. By 9:21, my phone rang. It was Daniel's number. I let it go to voicemail. His message was clipped, urgent. He said we needed to discuss my claims immediately. I didn't respond. At 9:44, another email arrived, this one from HR. It said my communication could be a violation of my separation agreement, and that further contact with employees might lead to legal action. But here's the thing. They never gave me a separation agreement. They had rushed me out the door without paperwork, without ceremony. Their attempt to threaten me only confirmed one thing. They were scrambling. I drove to a small coffee shop on the edge of town, ordered nothing, and set up at the back corner table. At 10:12, a text came through from Stephen, a junior analyst I had mentored. He said word was spreading that I had sent some kind of explosive email. He asked if I was okay. I didn't answer. I knew the panic I'd ignited would ripple through the building all morning, with each executive wondering how much I knew. By noon, I had everything I needed. Their silence told me they weren't confident enough to dismiss it, and their threats told me they were scared. They thought I had made a mistake by sending that email. They didn't understand. It wasn't a mistake. It was the first move in a game they didn't even know they were playing. When I walked out of the cafe and into the bright Colorado sunlight, I wasn't unemployed anymore. I was in control. And by the time the board finished their meeting today, control would be the last thing my former bosses could claim. By mid-afternoon, I knew I had rattled the cage. My phone had rung 6 times, always from numbers tied to Halverson Dynamics. I ignored them all. Silence was my weapon now. The more I withheld, the more they would show their panic. And panic always left a trail. Around 3 o'clock, the call I had been waiting for finally came. Not from Daniel, not from Kane, but from someone higher. A private number flashed on my screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. The voice introduced herself as Patricia Grant, General Counsel for the company. She said the board had received concerning information and insisted I come in immediately to discuss it. I told her I had already provided everything necessary and that further details would be delivered at the right time, to the right people. She tried to mask her tone with professionalism, but I heard the edge beneath it. She asked what I wanted. I let the silence stretch long enough for her to feel it, Then I hung up. I didn't want money. I didn't want my job back. What I wanted was exposure, the kind that couldn't be buried under non-disclosure agreements or golden parachutes. So I opened my laptop again, this time pulling from a deeper layer of files. Not just Crestfield. I had found older transactions, predating even that shell company. Consulting fees routed to a firm called Oak Ridge Partners. The owner of record? Patricia Kane, Martin's wife. Different name, same trick. The scheme had been running longer than anyone suspected, siphoning off millions in plain sight. That night, I dug through archived security logs. Buried in the metadata were timestamps showing exactly when Martin Kane had requested expanded system privileges. 18 months ago, he had personally altered financial approval protocols, something he had no technical reason to do. He left his fingerprints on every transaction. I gathered the documents, the digital trails, the registration records, and packaged them neatly. Then I created a separate copy, stored it on a drive that I slipped into my safe deposit box at the bank. Insurance. If anything happened to me, the evidence wouldn't vanish. At dinner, Emily asked how my day went. I told her it was quiet. That was all. She didn't press further, but she could see something in my face had shifted. I wasn't broken. I wasn't lost. I was waiting for the right moment. By 10 that night, I had drafted a report that stretched 87 pages. Every dollar misdirected, every approval logged, every family connection documented. I didn't plan to release it yet. Timing mattered more than volume. A flood could drown people, but a steady drip could erode the entire foundation. I went to bed that night with my mind steady, my body still. Tomorrow, the board would reconvene for its finance review. And when they did, I wouldn't need to be in that room. My presence was already there, in every line of code I had left behind, in every file I had copied, in every unanswered call that told them I was still watching. They had fired me to erase a problem. What they created instead was a ghost in their system, one they could no longer control. Thursday morning came clear and cold. I drove into the city, but not toward the office I no longer belonged to. Instead, I parked outside a quiet park 3 miles away, the kind of place where meetings happen without records. I had arranged one with Robert Lang, a board member I knew from years back when we built the company's compliance system. He was one of the few who still read every report line by line, one of the few who cared about details. I trusted that about him. He arrived on time, carrying nothing but a leather folder. We sat on a bench under a sycamore tree, and I handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a condensed report, not everything, but enough to prove the money trail from Halverson's accounts to Crestfield Technologies and Oak Ridge Partners. Enough to make him see the skeleton inside the walls. I told him I wasn't looking for a job back or for hush money. I just wanted the right people to see what had been hidden. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. He said the board had already scheduled an emergency session for Friday. He promised to read everything himself before then. By noon, the first cracks appeared. My phone buzzed with another message from Stephen, the analyst still stuck in the building. He said the executives were whispering, pulling closed-door meetings, and that Martin Kane looked like he hadn't slept. Daniel Foster, the CEO, was pacing the halls, red-faced. I told Stephen not to get involved. Just watch. That was all I needed from him. At 3 o'clock, I got another call, this time from Kane himself. He said there had been a misunderstanding, that numbers could look strange during transition periods, that he wanted to meet man to man. His tone was calm, almost paternal, but I could hear the strain beneath it. He asked what I wanted. I let him finish, then told him the truth. I wanted him to leave my family and me alone. I wanted the manipulation to stop. He went silent, then asked if I was looking for money. I hung up without a word. 10 minutes later, an email arrived. A new severance package, double the one they hadn't offered before, with a confidentiality clause attached. It was meant to look generous, like an olive branch. But I knew what it really was, fear, disguised as courtesy. I ignored it. That night, I sat at my desk with the files spread before me, each one a nail in the coffin they had built for themselves. I scheduled a delivery. Every board member would receive my full report by 8 o'clock Friday morning, just before their emergency finance meeting. Not from me directly, but from an anonymous account routed through servers they couldn't trace. I leaned back in my chair, watching the files upload into their scheduled queue. My heart rate never changed. My breath stayed even. Tomorrow, their empire would split open in front of the very people they depended on most. They thought they had silenced me with a layoff. Instead, they had given me the freedom to speak louder than ever, without raising my voice. Friday dawned bright, the kind of morning that makes the city look cleaner than it really is. I brewed coffee and sat by the window, watching the quiet street outside while somewhere across town, the board of Halverson Dynamics gathered for their emergency finance session. At exactly 8 a.m., my scheduled email deployed, sending every director on that board an untraceable packet. Inside was my report, 87 pages of numbers, trails, and signatures. Not theories. Proof. By 8:17, my phone began to buzz. Unknown numbers. Assistants. Directors. Even Patricia Grant from legal. I let them all go to voicemail. My silence was louder than anything I could say. At 9:03, a text came in from Stephen inside the building. He wrote that security had escorted Martin Kane out of his office and that Daniel Foster was locked in a room with the board. The hallways, he said, felt like a funeral home. I told him again, just watch. I didn't need to imagine the scene. I could picture it clearly. The directors flipping through my report, their eyes narrowing as the numbers lined up too perfectly to dismiss. The signatures of Kane on inflated transfers. The paper trail of shell companies in his family's name. The timestamps showing deliberate manipulation of financial protocols. They wouldn't be wondering if it was real. They would be wondering how long it had been hidden from them, and how many other hands were dirty. At 10:26, Robert Lang called. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He said the board was stunned, that Kane had already tried to blame the discrepancies on accounting errors. When confronted with the ownership records, he went pale. They pressed him harder, and by the end of the hour he was negotiating, desperate to frame it as a misunderstanding rather than outright fraud. Daniel, meanwhile, had insisted he knew nothing, but my report included emails showing his budget approvals tied directly to Kane's schemes. His denials only dug the hole deeper. By noon, Robert told me, both Kane and Daniel had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Their access revoked, their offices sealed. A forensic audit team was being brought in immediately. He said the board wanted to meet with me. He called it a chance to return, not to my old job, but to something higher, an executive role in security oversight. I listened without responding. The offer wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the shift. For the first time in 17 years, I wasn't the man they overlooked. I was the man they feared. That afternoon, the local business press broke the first headline. Halverson Dynamics executives under review for financial irregularities. No names yet, but enough to start rumors. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I sat back in my chair and felt something colder, heavier. Satisfaction, yes, but also clarity. They had fired me to erase a problem. What they got instead was a system administrator who had documented every line of their corruption, who had turned silence into a weapon, and who had no intention of stopping now. Monday morning, I walked back into Halverson Dynamics for the first time since they had marched me out with a cardboard box. The same glass tower, the same security desk, but now the guard looked at me differently. He didn't scan my badge. It had been deactivated, but instead handed me a visitor's pass with both hands, almost like an offering. He said, "Welcome back, Mr. Holloway," his voice low with respect. For 17 years, I'd been invisible. Now every pair of eyes followed me as I crossed the lobby. The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent. I had never been to that floor before. My world had always been servers, terminals, data rooms where the air smelled like metal and recycled air. Now I was stepping into mahogany and leather, into the kind of room where decisions shaped the company's future. 10 board members sat around a polished table. Robert Lang gave me the slightest nod, the kind that carried weight. The interim CEO, a woman promoted from operations after Daniel's suspension, looked uncomfortable but determined. She thanked me for coming, said the situation was unprecedented, and that the board had unanimously voted to create a new position, Chief Information Security Officer. Full executive privileges. A direct reporting line to the board itself. They wanted me to take it. I listened, but I didn't answer. I opened the folder I had brought and slid it across the table. Inside were my conditions. Non-negotiable. Full audit authority across all departments. Independent budget, free from executive interference. Veto power over financial technology decisions. A permanent record-keeping protocol that couldn't be erased without board-level approval. I said little else. Silence stretched across the table like a drawn-out note. The interim CEO flipped through the pages, her eyebrows lifting higher with each line. She said my demands were unusual. I reminded her that So was embezzling millions of dollars in plain sight. That had happened because no one was watching. Now someone would be. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I stood and told them they had until noon to decide. I said I had other offers and that I wasn't desperate. Then I left the room. The click of the door behind me was the loudest sound in the building. At 11:47, my phone rang. Robert Lang. He said the board had accepted every condition. My silence had forced them into agreement. For years, Daniel Foster and Martin Kane had treated me like a relic, an aging systems guy who could be discarded without consequence. Now the company they had tried to control had handed me the keys to its security, not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. I walked back into that glass tower not as the man they fired, but as the man they could no longer afford to ignore. 6 months later, I sat in a corner office I never expected to occupy. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Denver skyline, a view I had walked past for years without ever belonging to it. Now it was mine, not because they respected me, but because they had no other choice. The title on my door read Chief Information Security Officer. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had tried to erase me, and instead I had become the gatekeeper of everything they feared most. By then, the storm had broken wide open. Martin Kane had confessed when confronted with the weight of the evidence. He tried to cut a deal, blaming Daniel Foster for pressuring him. Daniel denied everything, but the emails and approvals tied his hands. Both men were indicted. The press called it one of the largest internal fraud cases in the company's history. Their names filled headlines, their faces plastered across business news segments. Meanwhile, Jason Pierce, the consultant who had been hired to smooth the transition, fled the country. He made it as far as Brazil before extradition papers were filed. The empire they had built on fraud collapsed overnight. The money trail recovered nearly $5.2 million, not all of it, but enough that the company survived the damage. That survival became my mandate. I built walls where before there had been none. Every system, every transaction, every request for access now passed through layers of scrutiny they had once called paranoia. My paranoia was now their lifeline. My former team reported to me, though I rarely gave direct orders. Instead, I promoted Steven, the young analyst who had once texted me in panic. He had potential, and potential needed space to grow. The others looked at me differently now. Not as the quiet man in the corner, but as someone who had seen everything and carried the power to decide what lived in the shadows. Conversations fell silent when I entered a room, not out of fear, but respect. They knew I had saved the company, even as I could have destroyed it. At home, Emily would ask if I was happy. I never gave her a straight answer. Happiness wasn't the word. What I felt was closer to completion, a cold satisfaction that came from seeing every piece fall exactly where it belonged. The anger that had burned through me the day they fired me had cooled into something steadier. Precision. Clarity. One evening, as I left the office, Robert Lang called. He said the board had unanimously approved my budget increase without a single question. For 17 years, I had been the man explaining why systems needed protection, why details mattered. No one listened. Now I didn't need to explain. I gave orders, and they followed. They thought they had silenced me with a pink slip. Instead, I became the one voice they couldn't ignore. By autumn, the case against Daniel Foster and Martin Kane had moved from the boardroom to the courtroom. Every day brought a new headline. Every week, another leak of evidence. Their lawyers spun excuses, calling the fraud accounting oversights and technical misunderstandings. But the forensic trail I had laid out was undeniable. The numbers spoke for themselves. The shell companies were registered in their families' names. The signatures were their own. The timestamps proved intent. No one could erase what had already been carved into the record. I kept my distance from the spectacle. I didn't sit in court, and I didn't give interviews. My work had been done long before the cameras arrived. Still, I couldn't avoid the echoes. One morning, Stephen walked into my office carrying a folded newspaper. He set it on my desk without a word. The headline read, "Former Halverson executives face up to 20 years." Their faces stared back at me in grainy black and white photos. I studied them for a long moment, then slid the paper into a drawer. I didn't need reminders. The reminder was already built into every silence that fell when people said my name. Meanwhile, The company began to change. My systems were no longer optional safeguards. They were the backbone of policy. Executives who once rolled their eyes at audits now waited for my approval before signing anything. What used to feel like paranoia was now gospel. I had turned caution into law, and though I never raised my voice, the halls carried the weight of it. At home, Emily noticed the difference too. She told me I carried myself differently, not beaten down, but taller, sharper. She asked if revenge felt good. I told her it wasn't revenge. It was correction. I hadn't burned the house down. I had just cut out the rot. She didn't press me further, but I could see she understood. The final collapse came quietly. A certified letter arrived at my office, delivered by hand. It carried no greeting, no explanation, only confirmation that Daniel Foster had resigned his seat on the board permanently and forfeited his shares. Kane had pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for cooperation, but his career was finished. Both men had been erased from the company they once commanded. That evening, I walked the empty halls of the building long after most had gone home. I stopped outside the office that had once belonged to Kane, now stripped bare. A plaque still bore his name, waiting to be pried off and discarded. For 17 years, those men had looked at me and seen a disposable technician, someone replaceable, irrelevant. Now their names were the ones being erased, their legacies reduced to footnotes in a scandal. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply stood there in the quiet, breathing it in. For them, silence had always been a weapon they used to dismiss me. For me, silence had become the weapon that ended them. Spring arrived in Denver with the kind of clear mornings that make the mountains look sharper than usual. By then, Halverson Dynamics had rebuilt its reputation, piece by piece, but the scars were still visible to anyone who knew where to look. New executives filled the empty offices, new policies replaced the old excuses, and the company's name no longer appeared in scandal columns. The crisis had passed, but the shadow of it lingered like a watermark no one could erase. I had settled into my role quietly. The title of Chief Information Security Officer carried weight, but I never let it show. I didn't need to prove myself anymore. My office overlooked the skyline, but most days I still preferred the server rooms, the hum of machines, the rhythm of order I had always trusted more than people. My presence alone was enough to keep executives honest. They knew I had the authority, the access, and most importantly, the memory. At home, life carried a steadier rhythm. Emily told me I seemed lighter, though not exactly happier. Happiness wasn't what I was chasing. What I felt was balance, a kind of calm that came from knowing I had stood against something larger than me and hadn't been crushed. Our children visited more often, both of them proud in ways they didn't need to say out loud. My silence had spoken louder than any defense I could have given them. Occasionally, I would hear about Kane or Foster. Kane had moved out of state, his career reduced to consulting small businesses that didn't know his name. Foster had disappeared from the industry entirely, his fortune tied up in settlements and losses. They had once held the keys to everything. Now they were footnotes in my story. One evening, after a long day reviewing protocols, I found myself standing outside the building as the last employees left. The glass tower reflected the fading sunlight, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel the weight of what had happened. They had tried to erase me, but in the end, they had erased themselves. My only weapon had been patience, precision, and silence. It was enough. I thought back to that Monday morning in the conference room, when Daniel had said, "Mark, after 17 years, we're eliminating your position. Clean out your desk by end of day." I remembered nodding, saying I understood completely. At the time, they thought I was defeated. They had no idea I was already preparing my first move. Now, as I locked the doors behind me and stepped into the cool night air, I realized the truth. I hadn't won by shouting, by demanding recognition, or by begging for respect. I had won by refusing to play their game, by letting silence do the work. Some men fight loud. I fought quietly. And in the end, that was enough to bring down an empire and build something stronger in its place. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.